Liyue, Mondstadt. Catalyst, Bow. Onfielder, Offfielder. Wait, what was the theme for my episode again? How very vague. But I can roll with it. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of my signature weapon series. Today, I'll be showing off some weapon ideas for Fischl, Ningguang, and Yanfei. These three are units whose kits focus on dealing strong elemental damage, whether it be as an off-fielder, quick swap, or a dedicated on-fielder. Down below we have disclaimers, timestamps, social media links, music credits, and a link to my Discord server. Captions are also available if you need them. Alright, without further ado, let's jump right in, starting with our one and only Prinzessin der Verirrtelang. I think I got that close enough.
Dusk and dawn, but fleeting shadows are. Once more, the twists of fate have led you into my everlasting night.
With Fischl being one of the more popular characters, as well as someone who has a wide variety of weapon options available, it's hard to imagine what a true signature would be like for her. Stringless is by far one of her best choices due to its 48% skill and burst damage bonus at R5. Polar Star is her best option with attack and crit rate stats, and while it's not her best choice for off-fielding, Mitternacht's Waltz already has the, Fischl aesthetic. She's also someone who's very strong in the meta, so I didn't want to make a weapon that would be a major power creep on her existing options. Instead, I tried making something along the lines of a balanced alternative with just a little hint of power creep. Ravenshot Blitz is a 565 base attack weapon with a 36.8% crit damage substat. For its passive, when elemental reactions relating to the user's element are triggered, the user's skill base damage is increased based on 4 to 8% of their attack, able to stack up to 5 times. The stacks will last for 8 seconds, and each stack is counted independently. While designing this, I didn't want Fischl to have another damage percent bow, especially since she has access to Golden Troop, which is a 70% skill damage artifact set. On top of that, a damage percent bow would just feel like a repeat of Stringless. Still, considering the other characters in the bow roster don't have a huge focus on skill damage, I felt that keeping the concept within that damage type was a good option to ensure it would remain a Fischl best in slot. Using an additive bonus also has an indirect effect on Fischl's teams, and that was bridging the gap between her Dendro and non-Dendro teams. This might, no, it will, get into a lot of numbers and nerd talk. So, a summary is this. Fischl's Dendro teams have a slight downgrade, but non-Dendro teams have a slight to massive upgrade, depending on what we compare the bow to. The skill base damage buff is the same mechanic utilized by Aggravate, a flat bonus that is added on to the original damage multiplier. A little Genshin lesson for those who don't know. Additive bonuses start getting diminishing returns the higher the base multiplier is, and also the more additive bonuses you add. For this next example, I'm using a Fischl build on attack, damage, and crit. While EM can have more value in Aggravate teams, her non-Dendro comps will favor attack, since her personal damage will take priority over whatever reaction she triggers. And for me showing the numbers, I feel it's always good to have the artifact build stay consistent. Now, if we look at Fischl using this weapon in Aggravate, her damage is around 1 to 2% worse compared to Stringless and Polar Star. But if you look at the comparison in a non-Aggravate team, there's a 40% damage difference with Stringless and a 5% difference with Polar Star. Another visual is that instead of comparing the two weapons with the same teams, we compare the same weapons with different teams. With Stringless, Fischl's personal damage is over double the damage output, likely due to her non-Dendro teams having no use for the EM substat. With Ravenshot and Polar Star, the damage is around 60% better, which is still a notable gap, but much smaller compared to Stringless. So why is this the case? Ravenshot basically functions as a pseudo-Aggravate weapon, which can function in any of Fischl's teams. Since Aggravate already sets a higher damage floor, it gains less value from the flat bonus granted by the signature weapon. Polar Star works in a flipped way. Buffing attack still increases the base scaling, which naturally means less value on the additive bonus from Aggravate. And then with Stringless, the damage is very dependent on Aggravate, so when you take it away, the output is much smaller. Now, I don't want to mislead you into thinking that the levels between Dendro and non-Dendro teams are completely even. No matter what, Aggravafischl is going to be her strongest team. However, utilizing this weapon means that even in Taser, Overload, and God forbid, Superconduct, she will be dealing a considerably higher amount of damage that can at least compete a little bit better with Dendro team. Isn't math fun? Yeah, I didn't believe myself when I said that. For alternate users, you want to focus primarily on units with good skill damage, and there's not a lot of characters who have this form of damage as their main source. To try to grasp at straws here, I'll do my best to pick a few possible examples. Sigewinne's skill has a pretty low base multiplier, which means the flat bonus from Raven Shot has a higher damage ceiling, but Sigewinne is HP scaling, not attack, so she might not get a lot of buffs from the bow in the first place. Childe has pretty consistent skill damage procs when Riptide triggers. This also has a lower multiplier, so you'll have a higher damage gap, but using this bow will take away from the damage he deals with his other damage types. Finally, Venti and Amber can be invested into DPS builds, including nuke damage from their skills. Just like Childe, however, this will be a DPS loss for their other forms of damage, such as their burst or charge attacks. To restate the summary from earlier, I found this weapon to fit Fischl due to its specific bonus on skill damage. However, because of how the flat bonus works, it has a nice effect that her Dendro teams won't benefit as much as her non-Dendro teams, which can somewhat address concerns for power creep. With Polar Star being Fischl's best weapon, this is the one I balanced Raven Shot around. Overall, I'm happy with the result. Anyway, that'll be it for Fischl's weapon. Next up is Ningguang, and this one is a more creative concept, but there's less math involved, so hopefully it's not as complicated to understand.
There's no need to use a vision in affairs that Mora can solve. As far as affairs only a vision can solve go, I know of only one.
When it came to Ningguang's weapon, I had a hard time figuring out what kind of niche to work with. She functions as a multifaceted DPS, dealing damage with multiple types of abilities. Some players like to use her as a quick swap skill and burst DPS, while others like to keep her on field and weave in her autos a little bit more. So I did have to make sure the weapon could at least serve as a general damage buffer to accommodate for all of her damage output. One of the things I saw with her kit is how her charge attacks don't consume any stamina when she has a Star Jade available. In addition to making this a good Ningguang catalyst, this will also serve as my experimental introduction for a stamina-focused weapon. Topaz Prize is going to have a 565 base attack, along with an 18.4% crit rate substat. For its passive, when the user casts a charge attack, every point of stamina that is not consumed from its original cost will be converted into a 0.24 to 0.48% elemental damage bonus of their element, up to a maximum of 12 to 24%, lasting for 12 seconds. The duration can only get refreshed if the amount of stamina not consumed is equal or higher than the current highest amount. Additionally, if the user is near a geoconstruct, attack is increased by 12 to 24% for 12 seconds. It's interesting to me that the stamina part of the weapon is the part that's less niche for Ningguang's synergy with this catalyst. Every catalyst user except for Heizo has a stamina cost of 50 when using a charge attack. If you manage to cast one without consuming stamina, you would max out the bonus for its full 24% damage bonus at R5. We'll get into it later, but a lot of Catalyst users have abilities that reduce or straight up ignore stamina consumption on charge attacks, which means you have a lot of characters who can use this first part. It's going to be dependent on each unit's own stamina cost. So segueing back to Heizo, even though his cost is half the amount of a usual Catalyst user, him using a charge attack is not going to grant any bonus. 25 minus 0 is still a net difference of 0. Even if he finds a way to ignore stamina consumption, his lower cost means he would only gain half the max bonus, because it takes into account individual points, not a percent difference. So it's a good thing he's not a charge attack unit in the first place anyway. For Ningguang in particular, this is a bonus that's available at C0, but is a lot easier to proc at C6. In a pre-C6 build, you would be forced to manually weave in normal and charge attacks to proc the bonus at the start or end of a rotation. Now, at C6, You have two options for your first setup. If you want to ensure her first rotation has the bonus, you'd still have to weave in the normal charge attack combo to proc the passive. But if you're fine with that bonus not being active the first time around, you can do a skill burst combo, then use her charge attack to deal the 7 Star Jade hits. After that, Ningguang should have full uptime on the damage bonus, since continuous charge attacks should refresh the bonus duration. There's another mechanic I put in place where the duration can only be refreshed when charge attacks have the same amount of stamina that isn't consumed. This was put in place as a safeguard, just in case you cast a charge attack that ends up consuming stamina. Klee's Explosive Spark on the A1 can have some inconsistencies. From my experience, if I tried doing like an N2C combo, sometimes I would be consuming stamina. Wriothesley's Enhanced Charge Attack has a cooldown of 5 seconds, so if you're someone who weaves in his charge attacks before that cooldown ends, he's gonna consume some stamina. Yanfei in particular has a Scarlet Seal mechanic, where her charge attacks might have some inconsistent stamina reduction depending on how many seals she has when she casts her charge attack. All of this exists just to say that different stamina consumption values will not cause the bonus to fluctuate. On to the second part, Geo-Constructs. Ningguang is the only Catalyst user who is of the Geo element, and by proxy, the only one who can self-enable the Geo-Construct passive. While this passive is still accessible to other Catalyst users, they have the downside of being forced to slot in a Geo-Construct unit to make it work. Most likely, this would be Zhongli for his shielding, alongside the pillar construct he creates. Knowing how fragile Geo-Constructs can be when it comes to boss hitboxes, I made the duration a bit longer than it needed to be. 12 seconds should be enough time for a standard field time rotation. All Ningguang would have to do is cast her skill, which makes a Jade screen. If it breaks immediately, she was still technically near a Geo-Construct when it happened, so you still get the attack bonus. And at C2, this is especially a non-issue, since you'll have that cooldown reset on her skill, which inherently refreshes the passive. For other units, you'd have to make sure the construct is active at least until they swap in, cause if they're off-field when it breaks, they don't get the bonus. Moving on to said alternate units, we'll focus mainly on the stamina portion of the passive, and the Geo-Construct part can be more of a secondary consideration. There are 7 characters who have some form of stamina reduction or ignoring in their charge attacks. These are a C2 Mona, Klee, Yanfei, Wanderer, Neuvillette, Wriothesley, and Veressa. C2 Mona synergy is only relevant if you play her as an on-fielder with a DPS-oriented build. Normal attacks have a chance to trigger a charge attack, which doesn't consume stamina. Klee has an A1 passive that occasionally gives her a spark, which can be used in place of stamina for her next charge attack. Due to her being a bit of a squishy unit, Zhongli is a lot more viable to reduce stagger. Some people also like to play her with Albedo for the lower team, and his skill is also a Geo-Construct. Yanfei is able to use this at C0, but just like Ningguang herself, the effectiveness of this grows with constellations. At base, she can have a max of 3 Scarlet Seals, which would reduce stamina cost by 45%. This means 22.5 stamina goes into the buff, allowing for a 10.8% damage bonus. At C1, stamina cost is further increased to a max of 75%, allowing for an 18% bonus. And then at C6, she gets the full amount of a 100% reduction, which grants the full 24% effect. Moving on, Wanderer in his skill state will not consume stamina when he uses a charge attack, so he can make full use of the damage bonus. Additionally, he likes having a shielder to avoid stagger. Thoma has a strong synergy with the double pyro resonance he brings with Bennett, but if you were to replace him with Zhongli, the attack bonus of the weapon makes up for the resonance loss, and you get that 20% res shred on top of it. Next up, Neuvillette can use his stamina bonus very well, due to his charge attacks having that stamina effect. But, as an HP scaler, he cannot utilize the attack buff, even though he brings Zhongli as a common support. Wriothesley and Veressa utilize the stamina bonus very well, as they have mechanics for a non-stamina charge attack. Depending on their teams and the enemies you're facing, you may or may not need to bring Zhongli. With all this said, this weapon can kind of be an indirect buff to Kachina, Cinder City has a 40% damage buff, and her skill is a Geo Construct. Wait, let me double check that it's actually a Geo Construct. Okay, it is. And her skill is a Geo Construct, so even if you don't need a shielder specifically, her buffing potential can still make her a viable contender for a team slot. All in all, this weapon is strong with Ningguang's potential to have a new best option in her teams. I compared her with and without Bennett, and found that in optimal scenarios, Memory of Dust is better without Bennett due to its insane attack buffing, but if you have him in your team, his burst makes up for the lower attack, providing more value in her other stats, and this makes Topaz her best weapon. So pretty balanced in my opinion. Once again, the whole stamina mechanic is an intro experiment, but I definitely want to explore its potential in a later video. Maybe a character kit? That'll do it for Ningguang's weapon. Last one on the list is Yanfei, and I promise hers is the most straightforward in this video.
Sometimes the law is compatible with human nature, but sometimes the two conflict. Balancing the two is a discipline in its own right.
Yanfei's playstyle is focused around generating Scarlet Seals to deal higher charge attack damage. You generate seals by using normal attacks, and from there, it was pretty cut and dry for how to design the passive. Sacred Codices has a 565 base attack and a 27.6% attack substat. For its passive, when the user deals normal attack damage twice, they gain the Affidavit effect for 4 seconds. This effect increases charge attack crit rate by 16 to 32%. Upon landing a charge attack crit hit, Affidavit will disappear after 0.5 seconds, and additionally, the attack speed for normal and charge attacks is increased by 6 to 12% for 5 seconds. Every normal attack Yanfei uses will generate a Scarlet Seal. With her burst, however, she will generate them at set intervals, which reduces the amount of normal attacks you have to cast. 2 common combos you can use in her burst state are either an N3C combo or an N2C combo. As you can tell from earlier, I opted to make the passive friendly for the minimum of an N2C. The charge attack crit rate has a slight delay before it dissipates, and this effect was put in place to address her A4. When dealing a charge attack crit hit, she can deal another instance of damage, which is also considered charge attack damage. And so, by adding a slight duration, we can ensure the A4 hit can also benefit from the crit rate bonus. I think 0.5 seconds is just enough to ensure the bonus stays, but if it turns out the A4 occurs after the effect would end, then we can just extend that timer. Not a big deal. Finally, attack speed. Usually, the stat only refers to normal attack speed animations, so specifying that the effect buffs normal and charge attacks is a relevant detail. All of Yanfei's animations will happen faster, and this means you could slot in some more combos in her rotations. With this, I do want to address a potential problem this weapon could have. Faster attack speed means faster elemental application. This can result in Yanfei having a harder time reliably triggering certain reactions, like Vaporize. So, implementing that bonus comes with its balance of potential pros and cons. As another note on the positive side, you do not need Affidavit to be active in order to proc the attack speed bonus. Here's an example. When you start Yanfei's rotation, you likely do a skill charge attack combo. This first charge attack does not have the crit rate buff, but if you still land the crit hit, you'll still get the attack speed bonus. Now, for alternate users, we have a pretty solid amount of contenders. Going from a list of most to least useful, this weapon may very well be one of Wanderer's best options. A common combo he has in his skill stance is also an N2C combo, which means you can maintain uptime on the bonuses very well. This weapon does nothing to buff his normal attack damage, so the only value is the attack speed. You also need to remember that even though the charge attack speed lasts for 5 seconds, the crit rate effect lasts for 0.5 seconds. So, it won't be a reliable weapon if you're someone who just runs a charge attack spamming playstyle. You have to run that N2C chain. On to other users. Klee and Wriothesley are characters who on-field a lot, and can utilize the passives very well. Wriothesley has a balance in normal and charge attacks, so this weapon will be a downgrade in his autos. Meanwhile, Klee has damage that is a lot more all around, so other parts of her kit like her skill and burst may see a dip in output. Heizo isn't necessarily someone who plays around his charge attacks, but he is a DPS focused unit, and an animal one at that. Using the attack speed part of the passive is a good way to buff his swirl driving in reaction focused teams. I will also reference Ningguang as a potential user, but honestly, her charge attacks are among the lesser relevant part of her damage output, so I don't see this weapon being that amazing on her. The attack speed portion of the weapon gains more value in rotations with longer field time. Finally, Neuvillette is in an iffy position with this weapon, but overall, I don't see it being super amazing on him. For starters, in order to buff his charge attacks, you have to do some kind of N2C combo in between piss streams, which is just going to add some field time in his rotations. Second, the crit rate buff is crit rate, which gives you a base amount of 73% with Maréchaussée. Less room to slot in that substat. On top of that, the affidavit effect only lasts for 0.5 seconds, which means only 2 of his charge attacks actually benefit from the crit rate buff before it's gone. And finally, attack speed is very much up in the air for me. According to the wiki, Neuvillette's charge attacks can hit no more than once every 0.4 seconds. If this means his stream has a tick rate of 0.4 seconds, then charge attack speed should be able to buff his output. But if this wording implies he is constantly hitting the enemy, but the stream has a cooldown of 0.4 seconds, then charge attack speed simply does not work here. Overall, Neuvillette can technically use this weapon, but there's a lot of anti-synergies that will hinder its effectiveness as a potential best-in-slot choice. To conclude and summarize on Yanfei, this Catalyst already plays around with her usual playstyle of N2 or N3C combos. It benefits her charge attack damage a lot on her basic and A4 hits, and it improves her attack speed to slide out more combos in a rotation. The only weapon that will stay her best choice is Cash Flow, being around 11% better. That weapon is dependent on HP fluctuations, such as a Furina comp, and since it's basically dependent on a separate character to be in the team, I was fine with this remaining as a stronger weapon, because without Furina, it's a lot worse. In general team comps, Yanfei Signature is going to be a new best in slot compared to other weapons. Alright, that's going to do it for this episode of Signature Weapons. Overall, I really enjoyed the design process for these concepts. Fischl's was a good exercise for me to practice balancing weapons to avoid major power creep. Ningguang's was a creative exercise to explore a stat that hasn't been fully expanded upon yet, and Yanfei's was short and simple. So I at least got to relax a little bit after making the other 2 weapons. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to support my channel. Let me know in the comments which of the weapons you liked, what you might change, and any alternate ideas you might have. If you want to share some original ideas for concepts in Genshin, consider joining my Discord server. Thanks again for watching everyone, and I will see you all next time. Bye!